Greetings and welcome to the Pandemic Podcast for this lunchtime episode today with Julia Hartley-Brewer, a journalist's take on the state of play. If you've watched the show for any time, you'll know that Julia previously had an unfortunate takeover of the show where I was recording from an underground location, a secret location where, in fact, it was where the Together Declaration was born in a secret meeting in London. Unfortunately, we were met with arduous technical difficulties, but Julia, the ever professional, took over the show and carried on the dialogue and actually answered many of the audience's questions. So I'm delighted to be here today from Bristol, where we're going to have another opportunity at actually having this conversation after we fell foul of the tech issues last time. So, but interestingly, unfortunately, there is even more to discuss now. You know, this situation ever unfolding. Julia's covering this on a weekday breakfast show on talkRADIO on a frequent basis. She's a regular columnist for the Daily Telegraph, The Sun, and the Spectator. And over the course of the pandemic, she's interviewed countless MPs, doctors, scientists, other experts around the government's COVID-19 response. And we both shared offline our frustrations at this ongoing event that seems to be somewhat of an existential crisis, which we'll touch upon today. But she's been outspoken about the consequences of the response, including lockdowns. She's consistently argued against any further restrictions, and something brought back into sharp relief by recent events in Australia, which we'll also touch upon today. She's now arguing against the rollout of the no jab, no job policies. The vaccine passport's already in use now in Scotland and Wales, and quietly on the back burner here in England, with the consultation closing last night. So we're going to explore all of this and more today. Julia is one of the few journalists who, for the past 20 months, has been exploring these issues, asking critical questions, and I'm delighted to be joined by Julia here today on the Pandemic Podcast.
Lovely to join you. I hope the Wi-Fi link lasts.
Well, absolutely. The last time we were very unfortunate, but we were underground in a very different set of circumstances. So there's lots to talk about. First and foremost, just off the press, this coronavirus lessons learned to date report that's been published. Have you had a chance to digest that? What are your thoughts on what's been released?
Yeah, well, I long to do a podcast with you where we go, do you know what, everything's fine now, I'm back to normal, let's moan about the weather and parking and potholes or something, but no. New report. It's a joint committee report from two different committees, very, very sort of, very serious committees, the Health and Social Care Committee chaired by Jeremy Hunt and the Science and Technology Committee chaired by Greg Clark, both former ministers, of course, are both Tories, but it's cross-party. And basically they've done the first sort of kind of mini public inquiry into what went wrong at the start of the pandemic. Lots of criticism about things like PPE, shoveling thousands of elderly patients out of hospitals into care homes without checking if they had COVID, as if that wouldn't have been a sensible thing to do. And criticisms about a failure to plan, test and trace. I mean, across the board. But one of their key findings is that we locked down too late. And this, they say, was as a result of groupthink by ministers, scientific advisors, and by civil servants. And of course, exactly the wrong lesson to have learned. Now, I was certainly not one of the journalists calling for us to lock down any sooner. I supported the lockdown at the time on the basis that the NHS could have been overwhelmed. The predictions were terrible. Certainly within a few weeks of going into lockdown, it was clear the NHS was not going to be overwhelmed. We had the Nightingale clinics. We could have then unlocked and allowed all the healthy young people at tiny risk of COVID to be having their lives free and not be closing businesses. But no, that's not the lesson they've learned. They've not looked at Sweden. They've not looked at Florida and Mississippi and North and South Dakota and Texas. No, they've decided to learn the lesson, which is what they always plan to learn, which is if only we'd locked down sooner, everything would have been fine. Well, I'm not quite sure how they come to that conclusion, but isn't it interesting that one of the chairs of that committee is Jeremy Hunt, former health secretary for 6 long years, when the Tory government was supposed to be preparing for things like a pandemic and didn't. So very easy to sort of blame just the Boris Johnson government for this one particular issue. But this has always been my worry, is that the lesson learned from this pandemic is going to be precisely the wrong lesson. We should have locked down sooner, and lockdowns are what works, when all of the evidence internationally, nationally, everywhere is quite clear that lockdowns don't in the end work.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just a matter of not working. It's actually about looking at the damage that's caused. And,
they're about saving lives. They don't save more lives. I mean, there's an argument on New Zealand and Australia so far. We'll see how that works out in the years to come.
Well, yeah, this 150-page report, exactly how many pages have been dedicated to looking at the long-term implications for public health, the record hospital waiting list, the record national debt, the record unemployment, and all of these things we've seen from the last financial recession that when people go into poverty, it has a long-term adverse effect on mortality, healthcare. So it's not really about saving lives. Yet here we are saying let's lock down soon as the conclusion we can make. It's quite flawed.
Yeah.
Do you think we're going to fall into the trap again this winter? They're already talking about record numbers of flu cases and deaths.
They're laying out the preparations already, aren't they?
It feels like it. I mean, do you think lockdowns are gone for good?
No, absolutely not. No, I think they're very much the future. I think there'll be one to tackle climate change eventually. I really think that this is a fight that we've only just begun. If governments could admit, and we've seen the Danish government's actually said, look, we did a cost benefit analysis. Turns out, it said it was a bad idea. We did it anyway. Sorry, we won't do it again. Do I think that most governments are going to do that? I don't, frankly. We know we've got Plan A, which is where we are right now in England. We've got Plan B, which is the vaccine passports, which are on the back burner, or aren't they? But Plan C is lockdown. Plan C is if the NHS looks like it's going to be overwhelmed, and pretty much everyone working in the NHS will be claiming that they're about to be overwhelmed. We are going to be we're going to suddenly be finding flu cases again when we haven't for the last 18 months. I've no doubt at all there'll be calls. I mean, we've had 18 months to build up the NHS resources. We had Nightingale hospitals. We had thousands, tens of thousands of very recently retired or departed NHS staff said, look, yeah, we're happy to come back and help in a crisis. Fraction of those actually called up. We brought up the private sector capacity, barely used a single bit of that either. And we didn't use the Nightingale hospitals. And then we dismantled them. And then we went, oh, we haven't got enough NHS capacity. We'll have to lock down again. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And as you say, the non-COVID deaths are where we should really be focusing. 12 million people on waiting lists. Now, okay, some of those are people waiting for hip operations and cataract operations. But you know what? If you're in searing pain or you're going blind, those are quite important operations to you, as routine as they might appear to the surgeon who's doing them or to the receptionist who's booking you in for that appointment. But I've lost count of the number of people I know who have loved ones who didn't go to the doctor, were scared to go to the doctor, couldn't get a face-to-face appointment with the doctor, couldn't get a consultant appointment, or were just told their patient their cancer treatment was going to be stopped, or it wouldn't actually ever start. I mean, we are going to see tens and tens of thousands of people, far, far younger than the average age of 83 of the death of COVID, who are going to lose their lives. They're going to be young mums of young children. They're going to be, young dads. They're going to be young people, middle-aged people who had decades ahead of them, who are going to lose their lives because we had a national COVID service instead of a national health service for years. And there doesn't seem to be any proper awakening to this by anyone working in the NHS. I think the new health secretary, I think Sajid Javid gets it, but I don't think people working in the NHS get it. They're still moaning about how exhausted they are, even though at least half the NHS effectively wasn't doing half of its work for most of the year. It for me, the NHS is the big sticking point here. They need more money, they need more staff. We know that. But the idea that we would lock down our society yet again, trash our economy, ruin our physical and mental health across the whole population because we haven't funded the NHS or staffed it up properly, I still find utterly bizarre. And my God, I have to fight every single day not to be a conspiracy theorist. And I do, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but they done off make it hard for us.
Well, yeah, the points you've raised around the NHS, the Nightingale hospitals, which were essentially, for all intents and purposes, not used. I mean, the other aspect of this is the cost to the public taxpayer. We haven't, I haven't seen a single report, including the one that's just been released, which looks at the total amount that's been spent by the UK government and whether it's actually made any material difference whatsoever, whether it's the billion spent on test and trace, whether it's the billion spent on Nightingale hospitals, which ultimately, if you put it in the hands of the people, say you need to decide whether you're going to do this because you're going to be paying for this for the next decade, which we are. But there's been no analysis of, the financial aspect, and also the financial aspect has been politicized because it's about saving lives, and we can't talk about the economy or money because we need to save lives.
We're constantly told every single life must be saved. I'm sorry, I think it's absolutely absurd. I mean, I've got parents in their late 70s, and I love them to death, and an elderly aunt who's 80, and I've been very clear with them. We've done enough for you. I'm sorry, my 14-year-old should never be stopped from going to school or having a normal life. We should never be stopped from going to work, going to the pub, going because of you. We've done enough for you. I really, really hope you keep safe. I'll do everything I can to keep you safe. But asking an entire nation to lock down, to give a few people in their 80s and 90s a few extra months of life is an absurdity. It's immoral and it's absurd. And this whole idea, and I've had this from, and every single cabinet minister who's been on my show on this topic in the last year and a half always say it's our duty to keep people safe, every single life. And I would say, no, it's not. We accept in day-to-day life a level of risk. And each of us accepts a different level of risk. We accept that there are people who we don't treat for certain treatments because they cost, £1 million, and the National Institute for Clinical Excellence decided that's too expensive to save one life. We make decisions about health and wealth and the economics of keeping people alive every single day in policy, and suddenly that was thrown out of the window for a disease that killed people on average at the age of 83. And that's not to say those lives aren't worthwhile, but we've got to get it in perspective compared with, children dying, at their own hand because they're so miserable they've not been out of their home for months, and people not getting treated for cancer or heart disease.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of keeping people safe, this has become a mantra. It's become an ideology. And I've said repeatedly on this podcast, you can't save an entire forest by protecting just one tree, which is what we're doing by just focusing on the safety of COVID, versus the risk of long-term hospital waiting lists,
But also the quality of life. I don't just want quantity. We all choose to do things in our lives, whether it's going skiing or riding a motorcycle or smoking or drinking too much or eating too much, where we say, you know what, I will accept that I will probably have a shorter life. I may be taking a bit of a risk with my life, but in return for the fulfilling nature of these things, I'm willing to do it. And it's not up to the government to tell us that we're not allowed to take any risk. I am perfectly happy to take a small level of calculated risk in my life and in my child's life in order to have a fulfilling, worthwhile life.
Well, absolutely. I think that there's Paul Dolan's work has looked at this. He's come up with an idea called the well-be, which actually, when we talk about risk, it's actually about the risk to our overall well-being, whether it's mental health, but even just things that bring people joy and keep them alive. It's the
seeing grandparents.
Absolutely. Well, fascinatingly enough, the people I've spoken to in their kind of 70s and 80s, the people in care homes themselves, so not one of them is asking for lockdowns and never have. And I spoke to an 86-year-old lady who said, do you know what, this is not living. What are you protecting me from? You're protecting me from living the final years of my life, which for her was just, I may as well just clock out now, which is a dreadful situation to be in. So we often look at people say, oh, the young people that they can't go to their gigs, they can't go out for dinner, boo hoo. But it's not just that. It's the elderly who are having their the latter years of their life removed, and I think that's also a huge injustice.
But also, my aunt was actually in a care home. We got her out of the care home because we figured we'd actually be allowed to see her if we put her in sheltered accommodation, so we would actually be able to see her again. We took all precautions. She's still fine, doing very well, but and lots of families not in a position to be able to do that. But it's often people are very very casual about that. Oh, young people going to gigs or being able to go to a restaurant or go to the pub. And it wasn't just that, it's keeping the economy alive, because service industry is a massive part of our economy and many other countries' economies. But also, you know what? Yes, going on holiday when I bloody well want to, where I bloody well want to, going to the pub, going to see my family, going to cinema, whatever it is I or you want to do. Why can't I live in a free liberal democracy? I don't live in North Korea. I don't live in China. That was the whole point, that we did get to do. We are free, are free agents. We get to do what we want to do. We get to make the mistakes we want to make. And I guess you're not allowed to put other people at risk. But frankly, a bunch of people meeting in a pub is just, if that was putting anyone at risk, which there's really very little evidence that it was, is only putting those people at risk of getting what was to them not going to be a serious disease, because the statistics were very clear. It was elderly and ill people who were most likely to be harmed by this disease. And we haven't for years not gone to the pub at Christmas because there's a flu bug going around, because we'd have felt that was a massive infringement of our lives. Now it seems to be accepted that you don't go to work because you've got a bit of a sniffle and a sore throat, just in case. I mean, at this rate, we're all going to be in our homes wrapped up in cotton wool forever.
Well, yeah, I've had this conversation on the podcast before. If you want to eliminate all risk, you can put CCTV in our homes so that domestic violence disappears. You can take the cars off the road to eliminate all road traffic accidents. You take the planes out of the sky. All of a sudden, we're no longer living. We're just merely existing.
Now, go back to caves, Yeah. No sharp objects.
Yeah, but on that point, are we freedom itself, which in many Western countries is a long-held value and principle, but in just 12 to 18 months, it seems to have been demonized, and now it's deemed as selfish to have any desire for freedom amongst many. Do you think we're facing some form of existential crisis? Is this a crisis of democracy?
Yeah, I think the West has completely lost its nerve. I think we've thrown away a lot of our values anyway by this sort of moral relativism, not accepting that. No, Western liberal values are superior to many other values held in the world. They are. That's why our countries do so much better and our people do so much better. But to copy a murderous totalitarian police state like China and think, yes, that was the right thing to do, and to learn and to see all of the devastation created by that and the damage to societal cohesion and mental and physical health, and to not go, hold on a minute, what on earth did we do, and realize the error of our ways, I find even more scary. I'm terrified by government wanting to come and help me and save me. I'm terrified by a media that largely will not ask the right questions, bearing in mind most of the media sitting in those press briefings are people I know personally. I mean, I'm sort of screaming at them saying, ask the right questions. And I'm terrified by the British public's reaction, indeed many of the public around the world, this sort of shrug and, but because COVID, and this sort of acceptance that the government knows best, and that these people, grandparents who haven't seen grandchildren for 2 years, families separated, people unable to earn a living, put food on the table for their families, people devastated by this, people getting mental health issues. I mean, the number of otherwise completely healthy, happy teenagers that I know, my daughter's friends or family friends who are now really troubled, really scarred by this. It absolutely devastates me and terrifies me. And I think that the thing that disappoints me the most is that the British people just sort of went, oh, all right then. And I really thought the British people had a bit more oomph about them. I thought the Brexit vote actually showed that, no, we're not going to be told what to do. We're not going to be bullied. We're going to stand firm and we're going to do what we believe is right. But they have been cowed into submission by political propaganda. I mean, we know it was propaganda. There were sage minutes showing that they were trying to scare us into our homes. British people are by and large more scared of COVID than most other countries because of that propaganda. It worked really well. And a media that has across the board, pretty much across the board, with the exception in terms of broadcast media only of talkRADIO, the station I work for, has not questioned any of this. Wherever they have questioned, it's why didn't we go into lockdown sooner? Why isn't lockdown stricter? Why hasn't lockdown gone on longer? And what on earth are you doing ending lockdown? Those are the only questions they ask.
Yeah, it's quite frightening. I'd like to pick up on that again in a moment in terms of why that is. But do you think this has been something that's been culturally? We live in this convenient society. People want to minimize their choices. And I had a professor of psychology, Professor Desmet, on the show. He talked about how, in a crisis like this, if people have background anxieties, they live stressful lives, what this enables people to do is attach their own anxieties to this external anxiety, which then takes the kind of responsibility of having to deal with their own problems. So by having this,
a lot of people really enjoyed it. I mean, quite apart from the fact that a lot of people have very nice homes and nice family lives. I had a great lockdown. The months that I was stuck at home before I was allowed back into the office, I got on well. I sorted out all the cupboards. I've got a nice home. I'm still being paid. Lucky old me. But I was aware really early on that this was, within a couple of weeks, this isn't how everyone else is living. I've not got someone beating me up. I'm not a child who's living with alcoholic or drug taking parents. We're not scrabbling for cash. We're not all living in a couple of rooms in a tower block. We had a garden. It was all very pleasant. But I think an awful lot of the people who make the decisions, whether it's the civil servants, the government ministers, the MPs, certainly the academics and the scientific advisors, and the media all live a very different existence from a huge number of people in this country and indeed around the world, where they are just completely cut off from the costs and the downside of lockdowns. And they just don't, it doesn't affect them. And so they're not really that bothered. They might have got a bit bored being at home, but other than that, it's been fine for them.
Well, I think you've hit a really important point. I think for a lot of people, people don't care about issues until it hits them in their own metaphorical backyard, and that's certainly, largely, the middle class of Britain have probably come off better off financially. But you're absolutely right. There's portions of society that have really suffered in many different ways. But here we are. The media has gradually asked some questions, but there's no story that stacks upon it. I remember reading, I think it was an article in the Telegraph, which talked about how only something like 40 to 45% of hospitalizations under the kind of testing regime were actual genuine patients. Yet there's no stacking of the story on that. There's no further investigation. What could that mean for everything that we've been through? What could that mean in terms of the way?
I mean, that's it. In terms of COVID deaths, I mean, it's the only way we're going to tell is in a couple of years when we look at excess deaths over a few years. I mean, we know one of the reasons why Sweden had much higher deaths was not because it didn't lock down. It's because it had an incredibly mild winter the winter before. And so basically a lot of those deaths were people who otherwise would have died in the earlier months before COVID hit. And if you can do these comparisons around the world, and I think in a couple of years' time we're going to be able to look at which countries had excess deaths and which didn't. And obviously, I don't think Britain's going to come out of it very well, but I don't think that's largely because of any government policy. It will be down to the fact that we have a very international, lots of international links. We got it fairly early, but also we've got quite an obese population, high ethnic minority immigrant population, which always plays a part in terms of big multi-occupancy homes and ease of spreading viruses and the like. So there are so many different things that are going to come together, but we're not going to be able to judge what policies really worked well until we sort of come out of this, because we've seen, haven't we, that Eastern Europe did incredibly well in the first wave, barely touched them, and they weren't locked down. Well, there was an argument, and then of course it's hit them massively in the last wave this year. So I think it's all going to come out in the wash, but I still do not trust that dozens and dozens, hundreds and thousands of scientists around each country and around the whole world are going to ever admit, turns out we got it horribly wrong. Really sorry about that, folks. I don't think they're ever going to admit it. So it's in everyone's interest. The media that didn't ask the questions, the politicians that made the decisions, the scientists who did the useless modeling and gave the advice against all the pandemic planning from World Health Organization and elsewhere. It's in everyone's interest to stick together and still say that lockdowns were the right thing.
Well, I think you're right, and certainly those stakeholders who are involved who didn't question it at the time. But I can envision in my mind, I can see the kind of talking head documentaries in 5 to 10 years, looking back, saying, "How do we get it so wrong? Why do we do these things? We've never done it before." I can see that happening, but we can't wait 5 to 10 years to have that lesson learned. We're still living it. Case in point, Australia. I was just talking to a guest who's in Melbourne, which is the most locked down city in the world. And as he described the conditions that they're in Melbourne, still only able to leave for an hour a day, only able to travel 5 to 10 kilometers from their distance to their home. I mean, it was like living back in March what we had here in 2020, but they're still living it now.
And the whole point of New Zealand and Australia closing their borders so quickly, locking down so quickly, was that they could then live freely. And there have been so many people saying, hey, but we've been living freely. We've had such a successful pandemic. Yes, they've had tiny number of deaths, but at some point, they are going to have to properly open up and get back to normal. And even with full vaccination, there will still be people who die with COVID. And I just don't think they've got to grips with that yet.
Well, again, that's the long-term implications of that, whether it's tourism, the import-export.
I wouldn't go to Australia now. I mean, it's you may as well go to North Korea. I'm so disgusted and appalled by the police treatment of protesters and the laws in Australia. I mean, it went further than anything we had in the UK. I wouldn't consider that to be a safe place to go.
Well, no, absolutely not. I mean, they were describing people using rubber bullets to fire at their own people, tanks going through the streets. It feels like martial law.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it is plausible. But again, didn't you think the Australian people had a bit more oomph about them? Would have gone, no. There's been some amazing protests, but by and large, these policies are really popular with people. That's the bit I don't get. That's the bit that really scares me, is that people want to be told by their governments what to do.
Yeah, and ultimately the difficulty with that for me is that once you allow a government to have that level of influence over your life,
Yeah,
then it's very difficult. History has shown it's very difficult for that to be removed.
yeah,
But also, you open the door and give permission to further intervention that we
yeah.
may not. A classic example at the moment is vaccine passports, where
Mm.
the government basically can determine who can and who cannot access certain parts of society.
Yeah,
Different parts of the world right now, we're seeing thousands, if not millions, of people losing their jobs because
yeah.
they cannot access their employment because of these things. What are your take on things like vaccine passports?
Oh, absolutely horrified by them. But again, I think most people just hadn't realised that you have these sort of ID biometric passports in China they've been using for the last couple of years, which when they extrapolated it to do a vaccine passport with it as well, where they completely control everything. You get these social credits, every aspect of your life, whether you can spend money, where you can get on a plane or a train, leave the country, whether you can go to university, whether you can get a job. Every aspect of your life is completely controlled. And the fact that the West looked at that and went, yeah, that seems like a good idea, as opposed to, oh my God, these people are terrifying. We need to start making sure that we protect ourselves against what China is doing. And instead, I'm stunned that Italy has gone down the route it's gone, full on. You can't do anything without a vaccine passport, without any proof. And then, of course, France in bars and restaurants and the like, and of course, Australia as well. Canada have just announced Justin Trudeau. Careful what you wish for, Canadians, not booting Trudeau out. Federal employees getting on a train or a plane. Joe Biden. I mean, you have the thought of the Democrats who think it's racist to ask someone to show ID to vote, but think that you should show your private medical records in order to go to work. I mean, quite extraordinary, really, the double think on that. Vaccine passports, they don't work. I'm double jabbed, but I will not show a vaccine passport in my own country. I have not yet done. I've managed to do the lateral flow test where that's been allowed. That wouldn't be allowed, I think, is the plan if it does come in England. I've used vaccine passport. I've had to show proof of vaccine to get into other countries. I don't have such an issue with that, simply because I've had to have a yellow fever jab to get into South America before. I've had to get hepatitis B to get into other countries. And I think a country has a right to decide who can come into their country. I think that is, as a nation state, a fundamental right. But for my own government to bring in something which means that I wouldn't be able to go about my normal business and go where I want without showing my medical records, when it's totally irrelevant. Now, if I were a surgeon operating on somebody, I think, yes, it's perfectly relevant whether or not I can show that I'm as safe as possible from giving that person the disease. But the idea that going dancing in a nightclub or going to a football match, it's remotely relevant, it's absurd to me. The vaccine protects you from hospitalization and death to an extraordinary extent once you've had it. It's about protecting yourself. There is some small element of protection for other people, that you're less likely to get ill and therefore less likely to pass it on. But we've never done that for any other disease. Same as flu, same as children being MMR'd. MMR is absolutely vital jab for children. And we've never even suggested that a child who hasn't had MMR shouldn't be allowed at school. And even though they would actually be a risk to other children. This is such a change, and it's such a big, huge ethical change, where you are requiring people to get medical treatment to live a normal life. And that is, as much as I say, go and get the jab, because I do think the jab is a life-saving jab. I think it's, but not, I mean, my child won't be jabbed. She's 14. She doesn't need the jab. I'm with the JCVI on their advice on that. But I find it terrifying that we have so quickly thrown away all of the lessons learned from the last century about the right of people to not have to show papers, to not have to have medical treatment they don't want. These are such fundamental things in a Western democracy that I'm amazed there's so little outcry about it, and I'm amazed that so many people apparently support these measures because they think it will make them a tiny bit safer, when in fact, of course, it won't at all.
I think, well, the thing for me, regardless of the efficacy or the safety of the vaccinations, we've got a situation whereby we've created a culture where people are assumed to be
Yeah,
sick rather than healthy,
yeah,
which is people have been I mean, I look back and think, how many consecutive days last year was I perfectly healthy, were my friends perfectly healthy, were my family perfectly healthy, yet we couldn't, by law, spend time together,
Yeah.
which is it's created a culture where people deem each other sick until proven healthy,
Yeah.
which is, all of this is predicated on this. And even there's been lots of debate about transmission. We still see these sanitization stands everywhere where the transmission by touch is obviously very limited, but the data shows us that. But similarly, asymptomatic transmission, where you don't display any symptoms, whether it's pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic, whilst it can play a role, is incredibly negligible. Yet we're still treating each other, though people who are physically healthy are still deemed to be a risk to others, and this is underpinning all of this cultural ideology around vaccination.
And again, it's just stoking fear and seeing other human beings as a threat as opposed to allies. And look, I take reasonable precautions. I'm out and about at work all the time. I say I've got aging parents. I came back from party conference season when, frankly, normally in normal years, you'd come back with God knows what, some sort of lurgy, cough, cold, nasty throat infection, because so many people all mixed together, not enough sleep and too much alcohol, and always come back feeling a bit unwell. Came home feeling unwell. Was planning to see elderly relatives, so did a bunch of lateral flow tests, keep coming up negative, but just wanted to be completely sure, because that seemed to me to be a reasonable thing to do. I had some symptoms. I had been somewhere where it is possible I could have been more at risk to catch, and I want to protect my elderly relatives. But the idea that I would just take a test every day when I'm perfectly healthy, when I'm not seeing someone who is at high risk, is a nonsense. I think this should be very much up to individuals themselves and to families about what they want to do. And the level of risk they wish to take. And I, for instance, my mum is a retired GP, and she very, very early on, she lives on her own, and she said, frankly, this is ridiculous. I'm not spending the rest of my life like this. It's not worth it for me. I know what the risks are. I've had enough. And I cheered her on. Good for her, because it's about your own personal perception of what makes life worthwhile, isn't it? And I'm like you. I know families who still haven't seen each other, and it breaks my heart, because I want to sort of laugh at them, but actually we shouldn't. We should pity people who feel that way, because they've been terrified into thinking that other human beings are a threat to them, which they're not, by and large.
Yeah, victims of the relentless fear mongering, really. Now, the other piece around this is that almost natural immunity, in a way, has almost been undervalued or dismissed.
Yeah.
And regardless of that point, we talked about this kind of existential threat. It feels like we're on this trajectory where there's almost this idea that nature or natural immunity plays no role in the future, and that we outsource our immune system from here forth. I get a nagging sensation that what we're witnessing now is a sign of things to come, in that we want to medicate for everything.
Yeah.
And that, because there's too much risk in allowing people to take care of their own health. They've already proven that they can't do that. So we're going to do it for, again, it's we're going to intervene by determining how you manage your immune system.
Yeah.
But I think this is a mission creep, and it, for some it might sound like conspiracy theory, but the signs are there.
Yeah, but again, is that technocratic? We know better than you. We're back to statins and things, aren't we? Everyone should have statins. Why? I'm over a certain age, everyone, no, people at risk, but actually they're at risk because they're overweight. Actually what people should do is be told you need to lose weight. If you don't want to, okay, well then you can have statins. But the medicalization of everything. Yes, I mean, certainly my family, we all caught COVID in March 2020 before we locked down. So we were actually already, isolating at home for, frankly, just too ill to go out. Not bedridden, but just sort of feeling really, really rotten, terrible cough and things. And I've been out and about since then. I've been on a number of holidays. I was one of the people who managed to escape the country before lockdown last year at Christmas, and there's a Christmas party for 25 odd people, and New Year's Eve a full big I was having a great time when everyone else was having a miserable time. Lucky old me. But I haven't. I've not managed to catch COVID again since. I've been double jabbed. That would, if I did catch COVID, it would mean I'd be at very low risk, but I already was, as a pretty healthy person in their early 50s. So I feel, yes, remarkably relaxed about it, but I felt remarkably relaxed about it as soon as I recovered from COVID, because I wasn't that fearful of getting it in the first place. I thought I don't want to get it, but once I had COVID, I was pretty relaxed about it. For people of my age and younger, not particularly an issue. I'm certainly intensely relaxed about anyone in their teens or 20s getting it, because we know what a low risk it is to them.
Well, on that point, we can touch briefly on the you mentioned the JCVI and their decision, which is obviously politically overruled by the chief medical officer. What surprises me is that I speak to lots of parents of young children who are kind of in the playground sharing the stories of their children who have tested positive for the virus, but gone on to either demonstrate no symptoms or been less unwell than they would be if they had a bad cold. Yet there's this real paranoia still that we must protect the children. Yet
well, I mean, I think the jabbing of the children, I'm told this is a parental demand, but I think jabbing of the children is about boosting our vaccine numbers, because a lot of the countries around Europe and elsewhere, they've been vaccinating children as young as 12 for quite a long time as a way of boosting their vaccine numbers, because they haven't got the adults vaccinated to the same extent. There's a very strong anti-vax movement in lots of European countries, particularly France, as we discovered early on in the rollout of the vaccinations, and so it makes their stats look better. Of course, ours then look bad, despite the fact that over 90% of people over 80 and almost 90% of people over 70, so all the people at risk have had the opportunity to have the vaccine or have had the vaccine. Virtually all of them have had it, and those who don't want it, well, I mean, frankly, I don't care. Do what you want. Have the vaccine, don't have the vaccine. It's not my problem. It's your problem if you get ill because you haven't had the vaccine. But the idea that in any way we're going to save lives by giving vaccines to millions of perfectly healthy children in their teenage years who are at tiny risk. I believe the stats to date are under the age of 20. We don't have the stats broken down much more than that. But under the age of 20, only 14 children in England have died. Well, they're not even children. Some of those will be 18 and 19-year-olds who have died from COVID, who did not have any serious underlying health risks. Now, more children would have died of flu in a normal year than of COVID for that entire 18-month period. Each one of those deaths is very sad. It's very tragic. I'm very sorry. But equally so are all the deaths from other things that didn't get treated. It's not the only disease. And the idea that you would vaccinate millions and millions of perfectly healthy children on those kind of odds, given that we know the small risks that come with having the vaccine, which the JCVI outlined for myocarditis and myocardia, the like, makes it ridiculous, quite apart from the argument that Dame Sarah Gilbert, the AstraZeneca professor, actually came up with the vaccine. The point that she makes about the ethics of giving healthy young people at very low risk the vaccine, when you could be putting that vaccine into the arms of elderly people in poorer countries and actually saving lives. So we're doing something that isn't actually going to save any lives, that costs a lot, uses up a lot of resources, and uses up scarce vaccine. And I just think we're playing politics with children's lives, and radher than actually saving lives.
Well, I absolutely agree. It's certainly politics is playing a key role here, and we talked about this over medicalization of human beings. I think this is a reflection of that, and of course, there is a lot to be gained financially by taking this.
It's interesting, isn't it? Again, not a conspiracy theorist, but it is interesting that it's the expensive jabs, not the ones sold at cost like AstraZeneca, that seem to be the ones that are very much being pushed as the safer ones. I mean, it's just a coincidence, of course. The ones that people are making billions and billions of dollars out of happen to be the ones that we're told are the best ones to give.
Yes. There's a lot of coincidence theorists out there at the minute, I think, with that regard. Now, ultimately, where this is heading, potential. We've already seen the flu headlines. We've got fuel crisis. We've got universal credit crisis. We've got people being exiled from their fired from their jobs for not taking a vaccine crisis. It seems to be a crisis on every street. How do we actually get out of this? How do we move forward?
There's a question. I don't know. It is fascinating, isn't it, that even with the energy crisis we're in at the moment is partly as a result of COVID. Yeah, okay, there's long-term energy policy as well, but it's also about this whole massive big boom in demand as a result of everything being sort of shut down for almost 18 months across the world. We've created all of this, and it's going to take us years to get out of this, and I think decades to get out of the mindset. I really feel we are going to be battling to get our civil liberties back, battling to get some sense back into our economic thinking and our medical thinking, and the idea that that our bodies belong to us and not to the state. We are not tools of the state for saving other people, and that it's not the state's job to keep us safe all the time. I think those battles are going to be running for years and years and years. I don't think we just suddenly switch this off one day. I'm thinking at some point we're going to need a political party, a newly formed political party, to just come in and to enact change, and a constitution that stops this from ever happening again. But I fear, alas, they wouldn't get the support. That's the bit that really scares me. Again, I've said it again and again, that the British people, I feel, are a shadow of their former selves in giving it. I can understand why countries that have lived under police states, lived under fascism. You've got to remember, most of Europe has done that. They've lived under communism or lived under fascism, been defeated in war. Lots of these nation states are very recent. We have such a long democratic history where every single right that we've got was not given to us. It was, dragged kicking and screaming from the authorities. We fought for that. People have died for those rights. And our right to, not be a papers please society, and our relationship with the state comes from that. And to throw it all away in a matter of weeks, as we did in spring of 2020, and even 18 months later, for so many people to be really unbothered about losing those rights, I think it's going to take a long time to recover from.
Yeah, I think the problem is people think it's never going to happen to us. But Western culture, like what Australia's seeing right now, Canada, it's quite clear that this is happening in comparable countries. Yet I just feel like we're sleepwalking into this new era. But
yeah.
You mentioned the term conspiracy theory a few times in the course of this interview. As a journalist, we've heard things in the media in the last 18 months described as conspiracy theorists, but lo and behold, within a matter of months, those things that were denied as conspiracy theorists in the press very quickly become a reality. So as a journalist, how do you begin to make the distinction between something that is conspiracy?
It's very hard. You have to be very careful of your sources. And I notice a lot of the questions coming in, a lot of people very cross with me about, why do you get double jabbed? And someone asked, would I get my booster? No, I don't believe I need my booster at all. But a lot of people, people on one side or the other, like, everyone should be vaccinated, basically hold people down and vaccinate them, or no one needs to be vaccinated, it's just a bad cold. I'm sorry, both sides are wrong. There is a much bigger middle ground here. And I don't think, again, you need to be a conspiracy theorist to think that once this had happened, once ministers and civil servants and scientists had sort of stumbled into, what the hell do? We haven't planned for anything. We've not got PPE. We haven't got an NHS able to cope. We've got a load of computer models telling us loads of people are going to die. We're all going to get blamed. What did they do over there? Okay, they did that. Right, we'll lock down then. I don't think you have to be a conspiracy theorist to think that actually it was just, frankly, cock-up theory. And then it's not necessarily a conspiracy after that point. It is just simply everyone's covering their backsides. No one wants to admit they got it wrong. They can't even admit to themselves they've got it wrong. I've had some one-on-one off the record conversations with cabinet ministers where I've said to them, but you must know that what you did was wrong. You've seen the data, you've seen what's happened since. You must admit now that with hindsight, you should have not done what you did. And they absolutely stick to their guns. I think they can't even allow themselves to believe that they got it wrong. So that's where we're not going to see people being honest about it. But the fact that big tech benefits, the fact that a lot of organizations, World Economic Forum and others, are trying to sort of use what's happened for their benefit to push their particular plans and beliefs and proposals. That's people taking advantage when they can. I mean, the climate change people taking advantage of this as well. So people taking advantage of a situation doesn't mean that there was one big conspiracy from the start for this all to happen. Trust me, I know these people. They're not clever enough. They really aren't clever enough to have a big conspiracy to, shut the country down or shut the whole world down. But they all did it because they are weak. They're scared, and they want to be liked. And when there were an awful lot of bots on social media pushing Italy to follow China, and that worked, then we had a domino effect. And there's no doubt at all, China was pushing this after they'd done so much damage to their own country. But I don't believe fundamentally the whole thing was a conspiracy theory. COVID exists It is real. It kills people. I don't believe it kills people to the extent that our statistics say they do, because of the way the figures are counted. But I think people need to get out of that mindset that it's a big, there's some big cunning group of people meeting somewhere in Switzerland who are trying to sort of do this to us. That's not what's happening. But there is a major failing on behalf of politicians, media, and the scientific and medical world.
I mean, I think that said, though, this kind of concept of Davos man, the world, you mentioned the World Economic Forum, they quite clearly have an ideology of what the future looks like. Again, it's this paternalistic approach. I just listened to a book called Winners Take All by Anand Giridharadas, and he talks. It's an in-depth analysis, and he's within the circles, right? He's a journalist within the circles who talks about the role of philanthrocapitalism, and that it's this idea that we know better than the public.
Yeah.
But they have the money, they have the resources to influence politics in a way that is far greater than the level of influence that the public have. And if you look at political membership in the United Kingdom, the lowest level in history at this moment in terms of political membership, I think less than 1% of the British population belong to a political party.
Yeah.
So broadly speaking,
well, money talks. I mean, that's the main thing. You can, we all know you can get any political party in any country. You get access if you've got money. And American politics is completely beholden to big cash, and so is British politics now. And that's one of the big problems we've got. And that's something I've been battling against for many, many years as a journalist, in terms of political donations and the like, and the influence they have. But yeah, there's no doubt at all. I mean, that was very similar to the EU attitude. This idea that we had to be in the EU because the technocrats should be in charge because they know better. I mean, there's really no evidence for this whatsoever, actually. I am a staunch believer in democracy. One person, one vote. Actually, the wisdom of crowds is really, really well researched, and the public actually very rarely get it wrong. When they're actually given a free choice and full information. And the problem we've had is that people haven't had full information, and have people got a viable alternative when you've got, certainly in Britain, two major parties, both of whom are just vying to be who's tougher on lockdown.
Yeah, well, under these conditions, then, Julia, you're a staunch believer in democracy. We live in a world where the days of traditional media have changed. It used to be newspapers, but today it's digital platforms like Facebook, etc. But they have enormous power. They're not supposed to be publishers. They're supposed to be platforms.
They pick and choose, don't they, when they're publishers?
Yeah, but the amount of big data that gets the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the behavioral science, the algorithms, the censorship. We know that people's perceptions are widely shaped by media, but new media has an incredible ability to shape people's perceptions of the world, which has been very apparent in what we've seen today, as in collectively speaking about what's happened in the last few years. But so how do we move forward democratically when we've got this large technocratic influence, I think unprecedented levels of influence, the likes of Facebook, Amazon, etc.
YouTube. I mean, YouTube just announced that they're going to effectively, to all intents and purposes, by demonetizing, they're going to censor a discussion on climate change. I mean, it's just extraordinary. I mean, I have my talkRADIO YouTube page taken down after 3 strikes for hosting a discussion with a medic about some aspect of COVID. It was you're a COVID denier. I've never denied it. I mean, I've had COVID. I've had the jab. How on earth can I be a COVID denier, for goodness sake? But again, even if I was, I still don't think they'd have the right to take it down, because I believe that free speech is you only defeat bad ideas and nonsensical ideas and unevidence-based ideas when you have good ideas. So I think this is going to be one of the big battles ahead, which is who decides what people are allowed to say. And look, a lot of people think that the internet should be allowed to be the Wild West, and we don't want government censoring what we can say on social media. But my God, I think I prefer the governments to have a say than the big tech billionaires in California, because some of the things that they are censoring, I mean, the fact that the censorship of whether we could discuss whether or not the virus came out of a lab leak, which is so, I mean, I'm sorry, the evidence is so clear that is the most likely explanation in Wuhan. The fact that you weren't allowed to discuss that when Donald Trump was talking about it, but you could as soon as Joe Biden did, I mean, it's outrageous. And we're never going to further scientific understanding of anything unless we're allowed full and free discussion. But if we're going to have censorship of what we can say, and there is going to be censorship of what we can say because it's already happening, I would rather it was a government that was accountable to me as a voter. And I know a lot of people online are saying votes don't count. Votes do count. You just have to persuade enough people to vote along with you.
Well, indeed, on that closing point, then I guess, I think with so many people disenfranchised, how do we collectively as a society restore the democratic principles under all of these conditions?
Use your vote. I mean, use your vote as people did in 2019 to deliver Brexit. Use your vote.
Indeed. Well, Julia, thank you very much for your conversation. Glad we could finally have this conversation, and thank you for at least asking questions on Talk Radio when so many won't. It's really important that we see this happening, and we've both seen in the comments that people have divisive views on these things. But to me, this is about having the town square. It's about opening the conversation, regardless of whether you agree. Because part of the problem, I think, perhaps you'll comment on this as we close, is that we've seen this tribalism. It's like you're over there, it's us and them, and the world has been divided on so many issues that it keeps us distracted from actually upholding these principles of democracy when we live in this world.
Exactly. I mean, I do think it does come back to those basics of the right of people to decide how to live their own lives and where to go, who to see, and without having to sort of account for themselves or prove themselves to not be diseased, or prove who they are or what medical treatment they've got, and to be able to speak freely. And again, I know lots of people on your feed are shouting at me, you just open your eyes, Julia, you should know better, Julia. Look, you've got the right to say that to me. I've got the right to say it back to you. We can have that free discussion, and another debate. We could go through the evidence for what you say, what I say. But that's what we do in free democracies. We don't want to go down the route of where China is. And my big fear is that we are learning by far. We started off talking about learning the lessons of COVID, but the worst lesson we seem to have learned is that doing anything that China does, because we should not be copying a single thing that country does.
Thank you very much, Julia. Julia Hartley-Brewer with us here live on the Pandemic Podcast. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you to our audience. And if you haven't subscribed to the Pandemic Podcast, just take a moment of your time to go to danjgregory.com/pandemic to join our mailing list for all of our upcoming interviews. And thank you very much. Have a wonderful afternoon. See you again soon.
Thank you.